Hi everyone, it's Raina. So this video is looking at the games that Aquarius plays. This is really a doozy because you have an air sign like Aquarius that I always think of the King of Swords in the tarot. This very, very detached individual who can be out of touch with their feelings. When somebody is out of touch with their feelings, they will very oftentimes be unconscious about their motivations. So they may engage in these habitual patterns and not even realize that they're doing it. And it can be quite crazy making for other people because some of the things that they do on the surface may seem completely, normal, but when you realize what's going on, it's like very confusing, to say the least. And that's the mind games that are going on. Now, this is, like I said, this is not necessarily known on the conscious level. And why do people play games? Well, there was a book called Games People Play, published in 1964, written by a psychiatrist named Eric Berne. And I wonder if he created the pop psychology genre itself. Probably not. I don't know. Because I know that there were books like that, especially after the early 60s, going into the 70s and 80s. But, and I think we had that book, Games People Play, on our shelf when I was growing up. But it was to try and show the different ways that people, I don't know if we'd say manipulate others, but in some cases it is a manipulation, but the way that they interact with other people in a very dysfunctional way to get their needs met, and creating these various convoluted scenarios. And for instance, I'm trying to think of a game off the top of my head. There was a game in that book. It was called Let's You and Him Fight. And that's really like triangulation, where you talk to two different people that are close to you in your life, and you say tell tales or gossip about what the other person has said about them, and then they're both going at it, and you're kind of above the fray, and you're sitting pretty. Both of those people aren't mad at you, they're mad at each other, and so you gain the upper hand in that triangle. Why would somebody do something like that? Well, yeah, power plays, wanting to be the top dog, wanting to control things more. A lot of people, especially when they come from traumatic backgrounds, being in control is very important to them because they felt so out of control growing up. So those kinds of things are probably at the heart of why people do what they do when it comes to games. And so, needless to say, when people cannot be authentic in relationships, it's really a drag. It really feels uncomfortable to be in a relationship with such a person. It doesn't even seem like it's worthwhile. And yet, in some cases, these are people that it's hard to avoid. Like, for instance, a parent-child relationship, a sibling relationship, a close friend, somebody that you've known for a long time. It may not be that easy to just kind of walk away from that situation. But yeah, there are some relationships that are very close to us where it's difficult to just abandon that relationship. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't pull away in some cases, because it might be so artificial and toxic that you just can't help it. You have to kind of distance yourself from that other person. So Aquarius is a fixed air sign, and you will find, if you deal with Aquarius people, that contrary to what is said about them being unpredictable, there are definitely things that are predictable about Aquarians. It could be a certain behavior that they engage in. Maybe it's their schedule, that they're very regular in how they do things. And the other thing too that's kind of like part of the contrarian angle that you will see with Aquarians is that they're supposed to be all about being progressive and things like that. And you will find that a lot of them probably do have prejudices. Prejudices are not always about race or gender or things like that. They can be about maybe somebody's income level. All people who are wealthy are automatically bad people. Everybody who is a Christian is automatically a narrow-minded person. These kinds of things. Now, it's interesting because they'll be like a kind of like a nugget of, like a kernel of progressive attitudes within that prejudice, meaning that the person is judging, the Aquarian is judging the other person based on what they presume is narrow-mindedness from that other person. So if they have examples where Christians are very judgmental and they are not inclusive, they don't allow different types of people to be considered worthy of God's love or whatever, then they can overgeneralize that to every Christian or every person of a certain, like we could say even now, like every man must be sexist in some way towards women, because look, we have a history of men oppressing women, down with the patriarchy. And they may have some proof of this based on past experience, but they're overgeneralizing to everyone. And the reason that this can be a game is that if you happen to challenge something like that, you will be pegged as part of that group as well. So you will find that when you try to have conversations with Aquarians, and especially if you're attracted to them because they are intellectual, because Aquarius is an air sign, that your conversations will not necessarily be that open and honest, that person may not allow for a variety of opinions. And yet they will swear up and down that they are very tolerant. So you will be met with intolerance, and then you will be gaslighted by this person on why that's perfectly acceptable to act in that way, because they have it all figured out. Obviously you don't support human rights. So you will find, because Aquarius is the ruler of the 11th house, which involves the collective and also humanitarian concerns, that Aquarians may oftentimes be connected to either some kind of group that, maybe it's an activist group or something that has to do with making the world a better place. And maybe that's where you meet this person. But when you talk to them, you find out that there's not necessarily this give and take in terms of whatever the issue is at hand. And if you vote for the wrong person, if that individual asks you about your political stance and they don't like who you vote for or some of your positions, that can be something that is reacted in a very uncharacteristically emotional, or if you want to call it passionate way. Now, I realize that there are going to always be Aquarians, just like any sign, that don't completely resemble what the sign stands for. So we can just look at it as behavioral patterns where this person is a very aloof person, and sometimes that aloofness can be very off-putting to others because they don't know where they stand with that person. So if somebody has an Aquarius boss, that boss may not be generous with praise. They may not criticize, but they may not be generous with praise. And so the person is always feeling this sense of unease because they figure that that person may not be pleased with their performance. And in the unaware Aquarians, there might be Aquarians that simply don't feel the need to do that, and it's nothing calculated, it's not even anything bad. Maybe they do think the person's doing a fine job, but they just are not necessarily effusive, with praise, or they're just not very expressive altogether. And that's a different sort of thing. That's not a game. What we're talking about is when someone is withholding something on purpose, or even if it's unconscious, there is a motivation that is strongly influencing it. Somebody who's that's part of their nature, and there's no even hidden agenda, that's a different story. We have to look. I think it's very important with Aquarius to find out what their moon sign is, because that'll give you a better handle on their emotional nature. The sun isn't going to do that because the sun isn't really the sign of that's not really where the emotions are expressed, through the sun sign, even though the sun is definitely the core personality. And if you have a sun in water, for instance, you definitely will have that orientation that is more heartfelt. If your sun is in fire, you're going to have more of that passionate exterior that a lot of people will see as emotional. And that is a definite part of who you are. But on the other hand, it doesn't really talk about your personal reactions to life. The moon is really where you're going to find that. With Aquarius, if their moon is in water in particular, so Cancer, Scorpio, or Pisces, the person will very likely have a disconnect between their goals and their emotional self and their relationships, so their public and private life. And they may function very well with their public life, and they may struggle in their private life because they really don't understand why they feel things to begin with. I know some of you may object to this because you may have inner plan, or I don't know if the people listening to this are actually Aquarians, but those who are, you may have inner planets in Pisces, and that can certainly make you more emotional in how you conduct yourself. But even with that, it's not like I'm saying that Aquarians can't feel. What I'm saying is that there's a disconnect. And a lot of times, even when an Aquarius person or all air signs are having some kind of emotional reaction, they can very easily kick into the analysis of that, especially if the moon is in an air sign. I like to give my example of Earth having the moon in Virgo, and that being definitely something that occurs for me. However, the one good thing is that when you analyze something, you really get to the heart of what it is that you're feeling. And so that doesn't mean that you don't have to feel emotions. You just want to understand them better. So there can be a positive side of, looking at things, being very conscious about emotional reactions. But I feel like the detachment is off the hook with Aquarius, so they can be almost like rather clueless about their emotions. And yet, there still are needs that they have to be met. And there are still traumas that are affecting them. So this can be somebody who blows hot and cold. That might be the biggest thing. And is that a game? This is where things get hard. It was so easy to make these videos when I was talking about the water signs. But now that I get into the other elements, it's more difficult to pinpoint some of these games. If the person has a moon in water, or even in some cases fire, you will see that the person may have difficulty sustaining intimacy with a person. It's almost like a circuit that overloads. And so they will create some kind of a situation or contrive a situation to have an excuse to distance themselves. And there might be some Aquarians who know that they're doing this to some degree. They know that intimacy is fraught with tension within themselves, and that they have always struggled in relationships getting to that deepest level where they can be great on dates and, for short interactions, but when it's sustained interactions, they may withdraw. And in some cases, depending on how uncomfortable they are with emotions, or maybe even with that Pisces energy, I think that with the water energy, this can be a motivating factor. They may ghost another person because then they don't have to deal with the messy consequences of dealing with that. But the thing is, I want to stress gaslighting. I think this is going to be true for all the air signs, because the air signs are connected to communication, and they don't want to be seen as doing something that is hurtful to somebody else. So it has to be your perception. You're the one who is misunderstanding the situation, and you're making mountains out of molehills. That's not what they're doing. And you may question yourself because they're so rational about it. So this is true for anybody who is dealing with an air sign individual and they're making their case against your perceptions, you have to have trust in your own mind. And you have to believe that you are doing things, that you're not misinterpreting things. If you're the kind of person that second guesses yourself a lot, then you're going to really be vulnerable to this sort of person and how they tend to be quite, rational about what they're doing, making you doubt your perceptions altogether. And so you have to stand your ground. You have to know that you're not crazy and that you're not overthinking things or overfeeling things. The bottom line with all of this is about what kind of relationship do you want? Do you want a relationship with somebody who is going to be there as an equal partner, or somebody who kind of comes in and out of your life? Another thing that can happen, and this is because when I'm talking about that, I'm really talking primarily about maybe parent-child relationships or romantic relationships where there is more of a direct, intimate type of partnership. For instance, friendships are relationships where being more detached is how it typically goes. And so we don't tend to have the same expectations for commitment from friends that we would do with our parents and children and romantic partnerships. And so another thing that can be happening with this type of person is that they are, what I was talking about, like just with friendship situations, when you're with such a person, they may present themselves as a know-it-all, that they have all the answers. And Aquarians can be highly intelligent, so you may actually believe them, that they are intellectually superior to you, and that if they say something, and also, of course, more of a humanitarian, more broad-minded. So anything that you believe, any opinion that you hold, will be deemed inferior, even if it's not stated as such. So in a way, that person is trying to mold you into their beliefs. So that's almost like being brainwashed. Now, again, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, and it may not be intentional, but what is the goal of brainwashing? To have control, to have that person thinking on the same page with the other person, and thereby doing that person's bidding. And it can get very deep, like ninth dimensional chess, of how that person is kind of overtaking their partner's life without that person knowing about it, because it just seems so detached. It seems like that other person has total freedom. They can come and go, so they don't feel like they're being held against their will, or like when you think about being brainwashed, being a prisoner of war or something like that. So here's the thing: you have to, when you're dealing with anybody and you can see that they seem to be overly detached in their reactions to life, if they don't, I'm not talking about flying off the handle or, being like overly dramatic. I'm talking about if a person doesn't seem to express emotions readily, how is that going to play out when you have your own needs that have to be met? Will you feel that you're with somebody who has empathy even? Because that's a big one. Sometimes these people may try to convince you that what it is that's bothering you is really not that bad. And spiritual bypassing can be psychological bypassing too, or we could say emotional bypassing. And so I feel like a lot of air signs tend to gravitate towards a religion like Buddhism because it does like to examine the mind and transcend thoughts and emotions. And then anyone who expresses emotion is obviously unenlightened because they're still attached to their emotions. And so, or if the person has an ego because they feel hurt about something, obviously they're in their ego and they're not spiritual enough. So if you get an Aquarian who's also on the spiritual trip and they start saying those kinds of things, it's very important to nip those things in the bud because it can sound rational and you can start to question yourself as a result. And this goes for anyone. If somebody that and is also in the New Age community, you try to share your concerns about something that's been bothering you, and they try to kind of wave it off and say, you have to stop being attached to the material energy or whatever. That can be quite dismissive, or if people, that's another thing about Aquarius, they may not they may not feel comfortable with your emotions, period. So if you have uncomfortable emotions about something that may have nothing to do with them, they may not want to hear about it. And they may, again, if they're on that spiritual trip, they may tell you that you're buying into the Maya of the situation or the worldly illusion. And even if they're like atheists, they may be like champions of rational thought and, oh, you're being irrational if you have emotion altogether. So how do you deal with people like this? Well, first of all, you have to name it. Rather than blame the person, name it by being able to describe exactly, the type of behaviors they engage with you to try to shut you up, to try to get you to not talk about your problems. And then you have the evidence of that that's concrete rather than just saying, you always, dismiss my concerns. That's too vague. You have to be very exact about situations where this occurred and how that affects you emotionally. If that person scoffs at that or otherwise dismisses your feelings, then you have your answer. The problem with a lot of people is they don't like, even when somebody shows you who they are, you may still try to change them. And that to me is a huge mistake because somebody's emotional reaction is how they are wired. Yes, I do believe people can change, but they have to want to change. And when you just stick around in that scenario and you're unhappy, then you're settling for less than what it is that you're looking for. So I think always we do have to look at ourselves, because a broken clock is right twice a day. Sometimes people, they may have their own issues, but they are right in some of their perceptions of you as well. And you have to own that. Some people are very emotional and they are very reactive, and they do have to become they have to become more detached. That could be very true for you, but that doesn't mean that you are not, your feelings are not valid in particular situations. And I think that's one of the big things, is invalidating a person's feelings and getting them to doubt themselves. This will typically happen if a person is insecure and they don't trust their own perceptions. But not, you know, when you talk about this with that person, like I said, if they do not respect your, at the very least, right to feel the way that you feel, then you know you have a problem. And then the ball is in your court. We can't wave magic wands with other people. They are what they are until they decide to change. And the truth is that when you do leave because you feel that you're not getting your emotional needs met with such a person, that will be quite helpful for their personal growth, because you're not enabling them to continue this negative behavior. But if you stay, then there's no reason for them to change. And so the likelihood of them seeing, the cause and effect of their actions is greatly diminished. Okay, well, that's what I have for you. I hope that resonated. If you would like a private reading, the link is below. Take care. Bye.